Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so very glad you've joined me this evening. I've got a most fabulous story for you that you're going to absolutely love. And I just want to send my love to all my listeners around the world. Good evening to all of you. I really appreciate you tuning in. And don't forget, if you haven't, to subscribe to my channel. I've got an amazing story for you tonight, as I said, and it's a retired police officer from the Washington state who had an encounter with a Bigfoot. And it was extraordinary because this Bigfoot absolutely knew what his rifle was. And it was only when this gentleman surrendered his rifle that the Bigfoot became more comfortable in his presence. So I think you're going to really enjoy this story. Let's get started. Dear Sarah, my name is Andre, and I'm a retired police officer from Washington state and have worked for the police force for many, many years. And I believe I have had some hair-raising experiences as a police officer that defy natural explanation. My Bigfoot encounter happened to me about 31 years ago, and is an encounter that horrifies me to this very day. It is hard to imagine that what I experienced was real at all. When I see the events that transpired that dreadful night, it is almost as if I am watching a horrific movie. It is almost as if the person playing my role is detached from me, rather like I'm watching myself from outside of my body, if you know what I mean. I truly think this is my emotional way of dealing with the horrendous chaotic emotions that occurred to me that fateful night, that completely transformed and altered my perception of our reality and the physical world in which we reside. I would like to say that 31 years ago, I had never heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch or the hairy man. The very notion of this creature wandering around the forests of North America was something that I was clueless about. I had always been a huge skeptic all my life. So if you had told me that you'd encountered a creature such as this, that really belongs in some horror movie, I would almost certainly believe that you were smoking something. I remember the night of my encounter as vividly today as I did all those years ago. It all started when I got a phone call from a lady who told me that her husband had gone in the woods to stake the area for a hunt that he and his friend Michael were planning to go on the following week. He was looking for all the telltale signs of deer droppings and animal markings that invariably would tell him a good place for them to erect a makeshift deer stand for the purposes of a hunt. She told me that her husband had left her house at 3 p.m. that afternoon, and it was now 8:30 at night, and he hadn't yet returned. I did not sound the alarm sooner, she told me, because I thought he may have gone off and had drinks with one of his friends. I'm used to him doing that a lot, you see. My husband is extremely social and outgoing, and it doesn't take much to persuade him to join you for a drink. When he did not return home, she continued, I felt that something was very wrong in my gut, and so I phoned up everyone that he socializes with, and no one had seen sight or sound of him. The woman was clearly distraught and sobbing over the phone. She told me that she really believed something quite terrible had happened to her husband. She felt it in her gut, and she just knew it. Well, that's what she told me. I assured the woman that she should calm down because there were more likely plausible explanations for his disappearance. I had seen it numerous times before when someone was reported missing at the station. More often than not, it was usually some level of miscommunication that had occurred, and invariably the missing person was usually found safe and sound a little later. I was also certain this was the case in this situation, but I knew that I needed to humour the woman by doing a search of the forest and going through all the right police protocols as an officer. The navy blue door of the contemporary modern-style home was opened by a woman of about 30 years old. I could see the area around her eyes was bright pink and puffy, which told me that she'd been crying a lot, and I did feel terribly sorry for her. I'm glad you're here, officer, she said. Just call me Ralph, I said. Oh, well, I'm Lisa, said the woman, shaking my hand warmly. I'm very concerned, officer, she said. This is not like Simon at all, to be out so long without even calling me. Well, I said, I'll go and investigate the woods. Where did you say they were? She gave me details of the location, and I drove to the area in question and parked my car in the clearing outside the forest that I could see stretched out for miles and miles. It was growing dark, and I only had my torch for light, so this mission was not as easy as I had imagined. I wondered whether I should call for backup, but I still adamantly believed that the husband would turn up eventually, and it really wasn't worth phoning the other officers on duty. I decided I'd just phone my partner, Mark, up, because I knew it would be an arduous mission going through this forest without a little bit more help, and besides we could well do with some extra lighting, because the woods were ominously dark. When Mark arrived, I did feel a sense of relief. It was so much better doing a job like this as a team, and thankfully he had brought a powerful light source with him, which made all the difference. I imagine the husband will turn up, I told Mark. You know the usual story with the frantic spouse imagining all kinds of weird scenarios have happened to their loved one. Mark nodded at me, knowingly. As we ventured into the forest, it was eerily quiet. The stillness was provocative. It rarely disturbed me because I was used to the sounds of crickets and animal calls that we so often in this part of the world hear. I could see Mark looking increasingly uncomfortable. These woods are sinister, he remarked. Something doesn't feel right here, don't you think? I was glad that Mark was feeling it too. Clearly I was not imagining things. I had sensed that something was terribly wrong too, but what was out of place I really could not say. Suddenly we could smell the foulest odour in the air, and it was positively revolting, reminding me of a decaying skunk. That's how foul the smell was. What in the world is that smell? Remarked Mark. I've never smelled anything so vile in my entire life. The more we ventured into the woods, the stronger and more horrendous the smell became. We noticed that all over the woods the tree limbs had been torn out of the ground, rather like weeds from a lawn. Who had the power to pull out heavy 1,000-pound trunks out by the roots? I wondered in astonishment. Hear that? I asked Mark. I could hear the sound of an animal snorting. For a moment I thought it was a hog, and I knew how formidable encounters with these creatures could be, because they can be prone to aggression. Hopefully, if this creature saw us, it would just run away, especially if we didn't bother it. I expected to see a hog, but that's not what I saw. Dangling from a tree branch was a man's hand. It had been tied to the tree purposefully with a piece of long grass. Whoever had done this was leaving a clear message to stay away. Well, at least that's what I thought. Or maybe it was designed to just scare us off. Mark and I stared at the horrific sight in disbelief. I was now very concerned because it was more than likely that Lisa's husband had come to an untimely end. I was concerned that he had become a victim of foul play, because predators do not hang hands on trees. Whoever had done this was extremely intelligent, so it had to be human, and a macabre one at that, who clearly got off on scaring people half to death. I immediately called for backup, because now I was concerned. Once again I heard the snorting sound, and became increasingly uncomfortable because I was wondering if the man who had harmed Lisa's husband was still loitering around the forest. He was clearly someone completely insane, I thought, or a nut that was short of a bolt. Suddenly we heard the most formidable growl. It went right through our body, almost like a bass sound. I do not know how else to explain it, but I will say this. It put a feeling of impending dread throughout my entire being. I knew with certainty that the sound was not of human origin. It was more supernatural than anything else. Almost at once I could feel eyes on me, and I knew that who or whatever this predator was, they were watching us in the same way that a savage creature stalks out its prey. I was praying in my heart, please God, make the backup team come now. Please God, make the backup team come now. Please God, please. Mark and I held our rifles in our hands as we surveyed our surroundings, carefully looking for any sign of movement so that we could unload our rifles into the surrounding thicket. Suddenly we could see this dark form gliding towards us with such stealth and grace, almost like a great, magnificent cat in pursuit of its prey. Whatever it was looked almost like an apparition in the ominous darkness of the forest. Once my torchlight caught a glimpse of the creature, I almost screamed out in horror. This creature, whatever it was the most hideous thing that I had ever seen in my entire life. In that moment, I almost saw my life flashing before me, like you would if you knew that you were yards away from an apex predator that would invariably maul you to death. I have never in all my born days tasted, smelt, and touched death like I did in those moments. I could feel the rising levels of bittersweet adrenaline coursing through my veins as my whole body trembled in terror. This monstrously ugly bipedal creature that stood before us was about 800 to 900 pounds, and he was very stockily built, with enormous chunky proportions. I would say that his massive chest measured at the very least 7 feet across. All over his body he was covered with the ghastliest black dreadlocks that looked matted and tangled and hung off his body in big tufts. His shoulder was very large and supported a bullet-like head with no neck to speak of. He had a long, hairless, primate-looking face with a very large squashed nose, a thin, mean-looking mouth, and the largest blazing red eyes I have ever seen. This creature was human, but he was not human. He was ape, but he was not ape. What in the world was this creature, I wondered, eyeing the thing in horror? Could something like this be real? Could it really be real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me, I wondered? Whatever it was, I knew with certainty that you would never believe such a beast existed unless you saw it with your own eyes. If you told anyone about this beast, they would never believe you. Never, not even in a million trillion years, I thought. The creature raised the corner of his mouth and let out a threatening snarl, showing a mouth full of smooth, human-looking teeth that were much larger than ours. I could feel myself shaking in terror, and it was impossible to stand still, which meant it was hard to keep my hands steady. So I kept my rifle focused on this creature. Should I pull the trigger, I wondered. I was afraid that my rifle was no match for this beast. I could tell he had the strength to tear both Mark and I in half like a piece of paper. There were no manuals written on how to deal with something like this. Should I play dead? Should I stand still, run, scream, shoot, or what? I just didn't know what the answer was. Supposing I unloaded my rifle, would that make the creature react even more violently and cause us more serious physical harm? Somehow I felt that shooting at this thing would be madness, because the creature looked like he was impulsive, reactive, and very unpredictable. My thoughts travelled back to the human hand that was tied on a branch. Had Lisa's husband maddened this beast by shooting at him? Somehow I expected that is what had happened. It was almost like an inexplanatory knowing that shot into my mind like a crystal-clear revelation that long after the event I was never able to explain. Whatever you do, Mark, I said slowly, do not unload your rifle, because if you do, we are both dead, and I mean dead. Mark was wobbling frantically, like a blancmange jelly, and I noticed that even his teeth were chattering violently, while there were beads of perspiration on his forehead that ran down his face like salty tears. Is this thing not going to kill us anyway? He said. Let's just both shoot now. What have we got to lose? Please don't, I said to Mark as calmly as I could. Trust me on this one, please. The creature continued to snarl at us like an aggressive dog, and all the while he seemed to be studying us and watching our rifles closely at the very same time. Suddenly he made a sound of a rifle going off, and I promise you that sound was the real deal. He imitated that sound to perfection. It was like he was telling us he knew what our rifles were, and he was not the least bit happy about them. He repeated the same sounds, imitating a rifle going off, and pointed his sausage-like fingers at us, as if he was mimicking the action of a rifle. It was extraordinary how this beast was able to step into the perfect role of playing or acting like a shooter. His reenactment was flawless, and I was stunned. He even acted as if he had been shot. He laid his gargantuan hands on an area of flesh on his leg and let out a whimper, and then he pretended to live. I was astonished. The creature had given us an Academy Award-winning performance, and I could see he had superior intelligence, and frankly, I was stunned. I looked at Mark, and he was in a terrible state. I realized he was shaking more violently than I was, with undisputed terror, and he had no control over his rifle that wobbled precariously in his hands. Suddenly I told Mark to put his rifle on the ground so that the creature could clearly see it as an act of surrender. Mark obeyed my instructions while protesting all the while. "Are you stark raving mad?" he said. I also put down my rifle, and the creature visibly relaxed. I saw the crinkles on his deep furrowed forehead dissolve and disappear as his grey skin suddenly smoothed out. He then took both our rifles from the ground and tossed them down a steep incline into the valley below. Suddenly the creature almost looked bored with us, as if we were a couple of toddlers who had got on his nerves, and he'd had just about enough and more than he could take. The creature suddenly yawned, looked extremely disinterested in us, and then, like an agile pussycat, he literally jumped down the steep incline to the valley below, where our guns had landed. Perfectly on his 2 feet he landed, and then he was gone, sounding as heavy and as loud as a steam train on full throttle, thundering through the valley. Then he was gone from our sight and sound. I looked down at my legs and feet in surprise. I was still in one piece and very much alive. I could hardly believe my luck. I was almost certain that I would have been dead by now. The relief was almost more overwhelming for me than the fear itself. Mark looked more surprised than I was that the creature had gone. This grown, brave man started to whimper and blubber like a puppy, and he burst into uncontrollable tears. I comforted him like a mother calming down a frantic child. "It's going to be all right," I promised. "The creature has gone, and I have a good feeling that he's not coming back. We both bored him half to death, and I think he wants nothing to do with us." It seemed like a while before the backup team of police officers did finally arrive. I was not going to tell them what had just transpired. I knew for a start they would never believe us. And so Mark and I just acted as if we had seen absolutely nothing. We heard the creature, I told them, but are clueless as to what it could have been, and Mark backed up my story. I climbed down the steep valley to retrieve our rifles from the valley floor, and was stunned by how the creature had leaped down the incline so effortlessly. If I had copied the creature, I would almost certainly have broken both my ankles, and maybe a few other bones as well. The police retrieved the hand they found tied to the branch. I think they thought I tied it there for safekeeping. That's the impression I gave him. I told them I didn't have any string. I was not about to tell them the truth. Sadly, the body that belonged to the missing hand was never found, but presumed deceased. There were tons of rifle bullets littered and scattered all over the forest, and I knew why Lisa's husband had met an untimely end. He had gone ballistic and firing at that creature. I imagine the creature was furious at being shot at, knew what the rifle meant, and as a result he just launched a deadly attack on Lisa's husband. But what he did with the body was a mystery, because it was completely gone, and no sign of those human bones were ever recovered. I was the one who had to tell Lisa the sad news of her husband's demise, and I will tell you this, she was extremely brave and stoic. I was amazed, and I was impressed how she handled such a crushing revelation. She looked at me and said, I always felt that he would go like this. I just somehow always knew it, but I never knew why. I looked at her and said, You mean like this clear, unexplainable knowing? She nodded. I knew what she meant, because I had just had that revelation in the forest earlier. So there you are. That is my story. What? All I can say is what a wonderful story. I'm so dumbfounded by that story, and it resonates with me somehow. I definitely think that the creature might actually have been a victim of a gun attack before, because I think it's very interesting the way he acted like he'd been injured and he started limping. Either he had seen another Bigfoot have a gun shot at him, or maybe he himself had experienced what it was like to be shot at. And clearly he was so enraged, which was why he actually killed Lisa's husband. But I think when the other two put down their guns as an act of surrender, he suddenly realized, well, I don't have to be worried anymore. So that was an extraordinary story, and we just really loved it. All my love to you all over the world. Till next time, goodbye and good night.